Greetings everyone and welcome to THE507, Lecture 9b, Part 2, where we continue to look at the book of Romans, this time through the lens of Romans 15, where Paul speaks about his travel plans and about the offering of the nations that he takes to Jerusalem. This gives us an opportunity to look not only at Romans, but also at Paul's collection for the saints in Jerusalem, something he speaks about in all of his letters, and which occupied a major portion of his life. But first we need to set the stage again, and so we come to Romans 15. To recap, Paul is writing this letter from the city of Corinth. He's writing to Rome, and he's hoping that they will send him on to Spain. 15 verse 24 says, "I'm hoping to pass through and that you will send me on." That's probably a request for financial and other logistic support for his mission to Spain. That's a long way to go, and that's a pretty ambitious goal. What's remarkable is that Paul says, by the way, before I come to you and then go on to Spain, I'm going in the opposite direction with the offering of the nations for Jerusalem, for the holy city. Paul says he has to make this trip to Spain because from Jerusalem, as far around as Illyricum, I've fully proclaimed the gospel of the good news of Christ. Literally, I have fulfilled the gospel. He says there's no more room for me to work. And so therefore, I have to go to Spain. The question, though, is why, if he's hell-bent on getting to the ends of the earth and to Spain, he's going to start with a lengthy and dangerous journey in the wrong direction, on a mission that he himself seems fully aware may fail. So he's writing to a church he didn't found and hasn't visited, but he's going to Jerusalem, and he's worried about it. Why Spain? Why Jerusalem? And why is Paul worried that the offering may not be accepted? We'll start by looking at Paul's collection, because that's the main topic in Romans 15. He says he's headed with the offering of the nations. And he says that he's concerned that it may not be accepted. He asks the Romans to pray for him, to join him in earnest prayer. That's something that Paul's offering for the Gentiles has its origin in the division of mission. Already in Galatians, Paul describes meeting with whom he calls the pillars in Jerusalem, James and Cephas, that is Peter, and John. And he says that when they agreed to divide the world into the Jews and the Gentiles for the purpose of mission, James and Cephas and John only asked that he and Barnabas remember the poor. And he insists that, in fact, they were already eager to do that. Before we look more at Paul's own ways of organizing his collection and the theology he seems to have for the collection, we need to say a word about background and in a sense about alms and taxes in Judaism. It's hard to overstate what a high place alms, that is, giving charity to the poor, had in Judaism at the time of Paul. I'll give this representative quotation from the Mishnah, which is actually codified somewhat later than Paul, but it stands as a good illustration of sentiments that could be found throughout the entire period from 200 BC through later into Judaism. The Mishnah says, the world rests on three pillars: on Torah, that is law observance, on the cult, that is the temple service, sacrifice, and on works of charity. There is a saying after the destruction of the temple that everyone was distressed and came to one of the leaders at Jamnia, at Yavne, and said, "What shall we do? The temple's been destroyed. We have no more sacrifice." And what passage was quoted to give comfort? The same passage Jesus quotes in the Gospel of Matthew. "I don't desire sacrifice. I desire mercy." And what the rabbi meant there by citing mercy was acts of mercy, namely charity, alms. There is a more concrete version of giving that was customary in Paul's day, and that is the temple tax. If you've read the Gospel of Matthew, you'll be familiar with at least one episode that entails the temple tax. The collectors of the temple tax come to Peter and say, does your teacher pay the temple tax? And Peter says, yes, I think so. And when he gets home, before he's said anything, Jesus says to him, Simon, let me ask you a question. From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their own children or from others? Peter says, well, from others. Kings don't tax their own children. And Jesus says, then the children are free, aren't they? Interesting bit of theology there. Jesus says, we are the children of God. And if this is a tax for God, God doesn't tax God's own children. That's the upshot of Jesus' little lesson. So he says, we really shouldn't pay this tax. But, however, he says, so that we don't give offense, go to the sea, cast a hook, and the first fish that comes up, you'll find in its mouth a stater. Take that and give it to them, for you and for me, for the two of us. That's the firmest clue that he's talking about the temple tax, because a stater is 2 half shekels, and the temple tax was a half shekel tax. The temple tax was believed to have its origin in a one-time levy that Moses commanded. When Moses was taking a census of the sons of Israel, he says that each one shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord, that there may be no plague among them when you are numbered. Taking a ransom was always a touchy business. You could sort of jinx yourselves by counting everybody up, and that might cause a plague. So to protect against the plague, they're going to pay a ransom. The money would be used for the service of the tent of meeting, which is to say the cult, the sacrifices in the tent of meeting. Obviously in Moses' day there was no temple, but they used it for the tent. And that it would be a memorial for the children of Israel before the Lord to make atonement. So what you have here, which becomes the temple tax, is the idea of giving money that would be used for sacrifice in the tent, later the temple, and that money somehow acted as a ransom or atonement. This idea is developed in Exodus, further in Nehemiah and in Chronicles, when the second temple is built. By the Hasmonean period, it had become customary to have an annual tax. Philo describes it as something that everyone pays gladly. He kind of conflates it with the first fruits, but he calls it ransom money. And he says it brings release from slavery or healing of diseases. It protects you from danger. And he says this ransom money is collected in every city. This is a big deal because first the Greek rulers and then later the Roman rulers didn't usually smile on a subject people gathering money throughout different countries or different regions and sending it to one locale, because that's the sort of way peoples tend to fund rebellions. But in this case, the Romans tended to have a pretty good attitude about this and protected it. He says, Philo says, for us, envoys are appointed, and they carry the sacred tribute. That's going to be important because we'll see something similar in Paul's collection, that is the choice of envoys. Philo goes on to say, the men are selected on their merits from every city, people of highest repute, under whose conduct the hopes of each and all will travel safely, because it is on these first fruits, this tribute money, that the hopes of the pious rest. Philo says this is a big deal. This money has to be delivered by the right people, and it has to get there. Something that might be relevant for thinking about Paul's collection is that the Talmud, and this is later than Paul, but the Talmud specified that Gentiles were not permitted to pay this tax, not even if they wanted to. Gentiles were allowed to give offerings at the temple. In fact, they did lots of that. But they weren't allowed to pay this tax. And you wonder if this is in the background of Paul being worried if his is going to be accepted. To even ask that question, we've got to say, is Paul's collection sort of modeled on the temple tax? After all, it's being sent to Jerusalem. He uses a host of sacral language to describe it. It's a liturgy and a holy offering. I'll give more examples of that momentarily. perhaps most strikingly, he wants representatives of every community to act as envoys to deliver it. And in fact, picking those envoys was a big hassle. 2 Corinthians is taken up largely with frustrations, misunderstandings, and suspicions about how the money was going to be delivered. I want to note here that however much Paul's collection and the temple tax may have resembled each other, and that may be in the background of his concern that Jerusalem's going to reject it, Paul isn't just saying to his churches, hey guys, you owe the temple tax. There are a few ways to note that. First of all, perhaps the most obvious one, in Exodus, Moses makes quite clear everyone pays a half shekel. The rich don't pay more, the poor don't pay less. Paul, on the other hand, is quite clear that people are to pay what they can. And that's different. If he was trying to make them pay the temple tax, he would just say, hey, everybody, you owe a half shekel. I'm going to pick envoys to deliver it. So it's not exactly a temple tax. So what is going on in Paul's thinking about this? One important thing to note is that this was a major preoccupation for Paul. Every one of Paul's authentic letters includes instructions about this collection. His usual terminology is the collection for the saints. He also calls it a sharing for the saints, a koinonia. The basic instructions are, put aside what you can and I'll get people to deliver it. In the case of 2 Corinthians, and I think you'll understand this led to quite a bit of mistrust. Now imagine you're a Gentile living in Corinth, and a guy shows up from the East, a Jew, and he says, oh, well, I'm not really a typical Jew. I'm talking about the Son of God. Recently he died and was raised, and you can get baptized into this, and you'll have salvation from the coming wrath. And you say, terrific, sign me up. And then Paul says, oh, and by the way, I need you to give money, not just to poor people around here. It's not just that I'm advocating charity. I need you to give money that I'm going to take to a place far away from here. This led to suspicion. And one of the principles Paul upholds is that this is a matter of equality. He gives a quotation from Exodus. He that gathers too much didn't have too much. He that gathered too little didn't have too little. That's about the manna in Exodus. Partly, Paul's worried about equality. But it's not simply about equality. That's not the reason the money's going to Jerusalem. It's not that Jerusalem is the poorest place. When Paul speaks about equality in 2 Corinthians, he's speaking about equality of the different Gentile churches that each need to gather money. He wants each of them to contribute. Some of the ways we can see that this is not simply about charity is that Macedonia is desperately poor, and yet they contribute to the saints in Jerusalem. If it was just a matter of taking care of the poor, there were plenty of poor in Macedonia. For Paul, this is not just about alms or charity or generosity. This is about something sacred. Paul describes himself as a minister, a liturgos, acting in a priestly service, taking an offering that he hopes will be acceptable, that he wants to be sanctified by the Holy Spirit. Those are all, especially the last four of those, terms drawn from the Hebrew Bible for the cult in Jerusalem. Obviously, it's possible to use cultic language metaphorically, as Paul does when he says, please be a living sacrifice. Offer a spiritual or rational act of service, of worship. The use of cultic language metaphorically was common not just for Jews and Christians, but also for pagans and philosophers. Nonetheless, we can see that Paul thinks this is something special. This money has to go to Jerusalem. If we look at Romans 15, where he discusses this most fully, he says, I'm going to Jerusalem in a ministry, a service that's not a sacrificial term, that's just a matter of service. A ministry for the saints. We'll note a few common ideas that come up. Macedonia and Achaia have already been pleased to share. This is a sharing their resources with the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. They owe it to them. Why? Why do they owe it? Because the Gentiles shared, participated in Jerusalem's spiritual blessings. This is not a matter of tit for tat vis-a-vis money. This is a matter of a koinonia in response to having ekoinonosen, having participated in what Jerusalem offered spiritually. He says they ought to be of service to them. And he goes on to describe this again as a ministry, and that he prays that this ministry may be acceptable. In Romans, this language of owing draws on terminology Paul had already begun to discuss in chapter 13, where Paul says, give to everyone what you owe, and owe nothing to anyone but to love them. And in Romans 15, where he probably most likely has the Gentiles in view, and he instructs them, you owe it to bear the weaknesses of others. If we look a bit more closely at this last passage in Romans 15, we want to ask a question about why is Paul saying to the Romans, please pray that I be rescued in Judea when I deliver this, and that my ministry may be acceptable to the saints. Why might it not be acceptable? Humanity has changed in various ways from era to era, but there has never been a time when people were reluctant to take money unless there were some sort of strings attached, unless it had some sort of significance you were reluctant to agree to. So we have to ask ourselves, Paul spends 2 decades of his ministry trying to raise this money from each of his Gentile churches, and he takes it to Jerusalem. In Romans, he says, I'm on my way. He really wants to get onto the mission field. He wants to go to Spain. But he says, before I can go to Spain, I have to go 1,000 kilometers in the opposite direction to deliver this, and I know it's going to be dangerous. Wow. So Paul thinks this is part of the gospel, is part of his ministry, not just evangelism, but fulfilling this mission. So did Jerusalem accept it? Was Paul right to be worried? To address that question, we have to turn to the book of Acts. Now, the book of Acts, 2/3 of it, or the latter half of it, is taken up with the Apostle Paul. And as you know, Luke loves the theme of sharing among Christians. Luke loves the theme of generosity. Luke loves the theme of money and seeing right things done with money. Luke loves the theme of unity. So if Luke has the chance to tell the story of Paul taking money to Jerusalem to show the worldwide unity of Jew and Gentile together, you can imagine Luke's going to tell that story with gusto, right? Paul's the hero of the book. This is Luke's favorite theme. This is a perfect storm for Luke. What happens in the book of Acts? Well, there are clues that Luke knows this basic fact about Paul's life. So for instance, when we get to the middle portion of the story about Paul, Luke says Paul is rushing to Jerusalem. He's actually passing up chances for ministry because he says he has to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost. Not only that, but he's traveling with envoys from every church. Acts 20 verse 4, Paul had with him Sopater and Aristarchus and Gaius and Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus. Wow, okay, so it seems like Luke knows the story. Paul's going to Jerusalem. He's got envoys from every church. And he's even talking about things that sound like the ministry, the offering. I'm on my way to Jerusalem. If only I may finish my course. This is the last thing he has to do. Sounds just like Romans. And the ministry, it's the same word he uses, that Paul himself uses, diakonia, the ministry I received from the Lord. What does Paul mention in his last sermon in Ephesus? Somewhat out of the blue. He's saying goodbye, I love you all, be good. And he says, oh, by the way, I coveted no one's silver or gold. I worked with my own hands. Remember what Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. That sounds almost random. Why is he talking about, by the way, I never took anyone's money? These are like points on a map, because Luke never says Paul's taking a worldwide collection to Jerusalem. And yet there's these little clues, these little almost quotations that suggest Luke knows that is what Paul was doing. That is what Paul was talking about. Imagine that same quotation in Ephesus if Paul has with him people with big bags of money. Then it might be entirely apropos for Paul to say, hey guys, hi Ephesus, time for you to pony up. I need your money. And by the way, you're doing a good thing. It's more blessed to give than to receive. I never coveted anyone's money. So what I'm saying is, although Luke never explicitly mentions the collection, there are these clues that he knows that's what Paul was up to and why Paul was so determined to get to Jerusalem. So what happens? Paul finally gets to Jerusalem and he's arrested. And there's no mention of a joyful reception of the offering of the nations. To the contrary, he shows up in Jerusalem and James says, hey Paul, welcome. I got bad news. Everyone here hates you. And Paul goes to the temple and someone cries out with words very much like what James's words were, Israelites, help. This is the man who's teaching everyone everywhere against the Jews, our people, against the law, and against this place, Jerusalem, and the cult. The only clue that Paul, the last clue, I guess I should say, that Luke drops, that he knows why Paul was going to Jerusalem, is when Paul's on trial. He says, look, the only reason I came up here is I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. So yet again, Luke sounds like he knows what Paul was doing. And most people would conclude, why hasn't Luke described Paul's offering and its joyful reception in Jerusalem? Well, because Paul's fears were well-founded. Paul got to Jerusalem with the offering of the nations, and Jerusalem said no. That's the only plausible reason for Luke not to connect the dots. He's put these dots in, and Luke doesn't connect them. And that's probably because Paul was right. He knew it might not be accepted, and it wasn't. Because it was bound up with the validity of his mission to the nations. It was bound up with the validity of his gospel. And the church in Jerusalem said, we can't take this money, because to take this money is to approve what you stand for. We can think about the book of Romans, in some ways, as being written with Jerusalem on Paul's mind. After all, he writes Romans about to head there. And some people have read Romans, as I mentioned in the very first lecture, as sort of a dress rehearsal for what he's going to say when he presents the offering. Both James and this nasty character in the temple say similar things about what Paul's reputation is. His reputation is that he speaks against the people, the law, and Jerusalem. Well, think of Romans as written, let's say Paul knows that's what people are going to say about him. Think of all the ways Romans has addressed precisely those sorts of charges. Paul says, folks, no, my gospel is not contradictory to the law. Folks, I'm not encouraging antinomian conduct. My whole ministry is geared around achieving the obedience of the Gentiles and fulfilling the law's true demand in them. I'm not speaking against the people. In fact, my gospel is to the Jew first. I'm not undermining the prerogatives of Israel. Paul devotes 2 chapters to that, as well as various other comments. And finally, by this very ministry, Paul says, I'm not speaking against the city of Jerusalem. I believe it's God's holy city. I value it. Why does he have to go to Jerusalem? His goal is to get to Spain. We asked about these two destinations. Why Jerusalem and why Spain? Let's start with Jerusalem. In the flow of Romans 15, Paul has just built this crescendo of citations that promise there'll come a time when the Gentiles will sing the praises of God's name. The Gentiles will rejoice with God's people, verse 10. Verse 11, the Gentiles will praise the Lord. Verse 12, the Gentiles will put their hope in the root of Jesse. Isaiah is the book that for Paul is the proto-gospel. He gets the story of God's dealings with the cosmos above all from the book of Isaiah. And something else he finds in the book of Isaiah is that not only will the Gentiles put their hope in the root of Jesse, but the wealth of the nations will flow to Jerusalem. I will extend Jerusalem's prosperity like a river. The wealth of the nations will come in. As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you. That's God's promise to Zion. And in that sense, when Paul has a ministry to the nations, the Gentiles, he thinks he's helping to put Israel and Zion first. Because part of God comforting Israel is God bringing the wealth of the nations to Jerusalem. This theme of the wealth of the nations flowing to Jerusalem is found throughout the Old Testament, a passage you'll know from the book of Matthew. Matthew, who knows the Old Testament better than anybody, opens with an allusion to the idea of kings bringing gold and frankincense from Sheba unto Zion. And we get this in Psalm 72. May the kings of Tarshish render him tribute, and the kings of Sheba bring gifts. One characteristic of Midrash, as I said in an earlier lecture, is the linking of certain names and saying, wait, there's two passages now that talk about people from Sheba bringing gifts. Well, here we might find our clue, not only why Paul wants to go with the wealth of the nations to Jerusalem, plenty of passages suggest that, but this passage from the Psalm mentions Tarshish. And that might lead for Paul back to his favorite book, namely to Isaiah, which concludes with this universalizing vision that at the end of time, God will gather all nations. Remember, every time it says nations in Greek, it's the same word as Gentiles. I will gather all the Gentiles or the nations, and they will come and see my glory. I will send apostello, cognate with the word apostolos. I will send to Tarshish and to the coastlines far away that have not heard of my fame or seen my glory. The people I send will declare my glory among the Gentiles, among the nations. Is Paul reading a passage like that and finding his own destiny? It's not entirely clear where the biblical Tarshish is, but it's somewhere in the West, and a case can be made that it's Spain, the farthest destination in the West in the ancient mindset. And think about how Paul has already read Isaiah to describe his own work. How will people proclaim unless they are sent? He asks in Romans 10. Well, I'm the one who's sent. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring the gospel, who preach the good news. He feels like Isaiah is describing what he's up to. And if Isaiah says the last thing to happen is for someone to be sent to Tarshish and to gather the wealth of the nations to bring to Zion, is this what Paul sees as his ministry? In the end of the day, you can't prove that Paul thought Spain was Tarshish. It's possible. It's suggestive. I find it kind of attractive. But whether or not you can prove that, if you wanted to step back and read canonically, I don't know if you're familiar with a phrase like canonical criticism, but sort of saying, all right, let's take this whole book in its final form. You could say that Paul is a prophet who sort of stands as a one bookend, as the opposite of Jonah. When God sent Jonah to Nineveh in the east, Jonah said, heck no. And he went the opposite way to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Why did Jonah do that? for precisely the opposite reason Paul has for going to Spain. Whereas Paul went to announce God's mercy, Jonah said, "The reason I fled to Tarshish is that I knew you are a merciful God, abounding in steadfast love and ready to relent from punishing. And frankly, God, I didn't want to go to those Gentiles because I knew you'd be merciful to them." It's almost like Paul fits as the opposite of that same impulse, going to the ends of the earth to proclaim God's mercy. If we were to summarize here, why Spain? Well, perhaps to fulfill sort of a biblical mission. The other question is, did Paul ever make it? We know from the book of Acts, we can probably infer from the book of Acts that Paul's mission to Jerusalem was unsuccessful. Did he make it to Rome? Did he make it to Spain? Well, the book of Acts ends with Paul saying, with the narrator saying, "And so we came to Rome." And Acts ends there, with Paul imprisoned in Rome. Now, Acts ends without saying, is it possible that Paul got out or was he executed? Most people think he was probably executed there in Rome. There are some early Christian traditions that Paul made it all the way to Spain. They may just be reading Romans 15 and concluding, surely he succeeded. There is a cryptic comment from later in the first century in a book called First Clement. And Clement, speaking about Paul's heroism, says, "When Paul had taught righteousness to the whole world, he reached the farthest limits of the West. And when he had given his testimony before the rulers, he departed from this world." That is, Paul was killed. We know Paul was killed in Rome. And most likely, when First Clement says Paul reached the furthest limits of the West, he doesn't mean Spain, although that's possible. But more likely, First Clement means when Paul had reached Rome, the farthest west in the civilized world. And the fact that he refers to Paul giving testimony before the rulers sounds like Paul on trial in Rome. And since that's where Paul was martyred, that's most likely what First Clement has in mind. We'll leave as an open question whether Paul ever made it to Spain. We'll stop here with noting Paul's really extraordinary ambition. Two final points to take away from Romans 15 and Paul's plan. One, the number of Christians at this point, the time that Paul's writing, can't be more than in the thousands. And yet Paul says, you know what, there's no room for me to work. In the Near East, in Turkey, in Macedonia, into the Balkans, yeah, I'm done. There's nowhere else to go. I'm finished there. There's no room for me. And there's already a church in Rome. Forget the whole rest of the Italian peninsula. Therefore, I need to go all the way to Spain. That's an amazing vision, and I don't entirely know how to interpret it. It bespeaks of Paul's ambition to preach the gospel where it hadn't been preached. I think it also says something about Paul's confidence in these little cells, these little churches he's started, that they can get the job done. Once I start them, God will continue to spread the word through them. I don't need to be there. The other point, and I hope I haven't belabored this too much, is that for Paul to be that determined an evangelist, that he wants to go all the way to Spain, it stands out as all the more striking that he first planned to go to Jerusalem on a mission that he knew was risky and probably didn't actually work out. Here's what that says to me, is that Paul saw the worldwide unity of this movement as absolutely paramount. Paul could have just said, you know what, there's a lot of people in Jerusalem who don't like me. Tough cookies. I'm going elsewhere. I'm right, they're wrong. I don't care. I don't care if they like me. And the first time he's having trouble in Corinth and people say, oh, what are you doing taking our money to Jerusalem? He could have just said, you know what, you're right. Jesus said it's more blessed to give than receive. Just find someone who needs money and give them money. I encourage a principle of charity. Paul didn't say that. He spent his entire ministry trying to collect this offering of the Gentiles for Jerusalem. That says something about the value he placed on unity throughout the worldwide movement, and also on what we might call the biblical storyline, that this is what he finds predicted in the prophets, and he's going to be part of that story. And he's not willing to let go of it. He's quite tenacious and visionary and heroic about it. Whether or not Paul ever made it to Spain, we know that he was killed in the middle of the 60s of the first century, executed in Rome. In the subsequent lectures, we'll turn to what are commonly called the Deutero-Pauline and the Pseudo-Pauline epistles. That is, letters which, for various reasons and for better and worse grounds, are held to be written not by Paul himself, but by his followers. And we'll see that a figure who was this dynamic and this controversial in his lifetime also yielded a legacy which would be fought over. There were people claiming to be followers of Paul with rather different visions of what it meant to be true to the spirit of the apostle to the Gentiles.